know we have some people trying to get here from the British scrimmage, but they're just going to have to sit in the back. On behalf of the Western Montana Spiritual Development Council, I want to welcome you especially to this talk. If you don't know us, we're a very loose coalition of members and a few clergy. We began in 2005. We have members from about 20 plus faith communities in Missoula and surrounding areas. And our mission is really to encourage interfaith dialogue through bringing nationally known spiritual speakers to Missoula and sponsoring events for spiritual development education. We actually consider tonight an Irish talk part of our mission. We meet fairly irregularly when somebody has a good idea, like, oh, why don't we invite Jim Wallace to come? Or why don't we invite Aaron Brown? And we have no funding except what we make on talks and DVDs. And this talk is open to everyone. It's not particularly for any religious persuasion. The spiritual, but not religious, are most welcome. There's several housekeeping chores. First of all, MCAT is taping tonight. And we'll be filming the talk and discussion. If you don't wish your image to be shown, you can move to the back and get out of the range of Ron's camera. Otherwise, you can also watch it on broadcast. We want to especially thank Christ the King for granting us this beautiful space and making it possible to have us here. And for Missoula Valley Church for giving us some extra parking on Higgins. If any of you benefited from that, we're particularly grateful to them. We will have DVD copies, as I mentioned. You can purchase them sometime this summer. We're taking sign-ups downstairs. If you can check your cell phones now, that would be appreciated, except for medical pages. I guess we'll let you guys leave them on. Restrooms, the women's restroom is out the doors to the right and up a short flight of stairs. The men's is downstairs and to the left. And after the talk, and there will be a reception, we have lots of treats that we brought. There are tables downstairs for all of the providers who work with end-of-life care in Missoula. Ira's books are on sale, and he will be signing books as long as his arm holds out. So please come down. I think you'll want a copy of the book. I'm wondering how many of you are here by yourself. Don't have to raise your hands. And how many of you are here with somebody who might be the person who will be named to carry out your wishes? Well, in case you're here by yourself, I would really like to encourage you to buy the book, because it's a little hard to go home from this talk and say, gee, dear, I just heard the best talk about dying and end-of-life care. It's not a conversation starter. So you can say, hi, dear, I just learned how to have the best care possible, and maybe they'll be a little more interested. Again, St. Patrick Hospital, Hospice of Missoula, Partners in Home Care Hospice, Aspen Hospice in the Bitterroot, Parish Nurses of Missoula, and the new Montana Leadership Training for Advanced Care Planning are listed in your program, and they're the ones who have information tables downstairs. And at the end, we'll explain if any of you have limited mobility how to get there. I now would like to introduce our speaker. Ira's lifetime of journeying with people who are dying has taught him that life is inherently spiritual, whether a person has religious beliefs or not, and never more so than when close to death. We saw this talk as an opportunity to share his and our belief that the end of life is to be honored, free of pain, and full of love, and that we as a community have a critical role to play in educating our members and ourselves. We know we all want the best care possible, and I have to tell you, since I just finished the book, I had a lot to learn about what that's going to mean for myself and my family. We all have stories about good dying and end of life, and we all probably carry stories when it has not gone so well. Ira writes that when any one person is sick, the family experiences the illness, and so do our friends, especially in the faith community. His book describes how all of us need to be involved in that care and to be cared for. For those of you who haven't worked with Ira before, and that's only half of the room, he came to Missoula in 1984 as an emergency room physician. He was already committed to hospice and palliative care, and he soon began organizing the first hospice program in Missoula. And as the hospice medical director, he convinced several national foundations to fund the Missoula Demonstration Project in 1996. That was a 10-year effort to study and improve end-of-life end-of-life care in this community, for which he served as principal investigator. His work in Missoula gained him national prominence rather quickly. He was elected president of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Care in 1997, and he left Missoula in 2004 to become director of palliative medicine in Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center and chair of palliative medicine now at Dartmouth Medical School. He's the author of several books. He reinforces Missoula's reputation as growing good writers, and his books have reshaped the national vision about end of life and taught us how to make that time a time of growth and grace rather than suffering and pain. The first book, Dying Well, was followed by the 4 things that matter most, which is used nationwide in hospice and pastoral counseling. And his new book, The Best Care Possible, tackles the crisis that surrounds serious illness and dying in America and how we need to transform care for the end of life. He's also co-authored with my husband and I the book, A Few Months to Live, Different Paths to Life's End, about end-of-life care in Missoula in the 90s. And the copies of the last 3 books are for sale after the talk downstairs. He has been honored by National Hospice, Cancer, Physician, and Catholic Chaplains organizations. He's been a featured guest on national television programs. And despite all these honors and national fame, we are certain that Ira's heart remains here in Missoula. So the council is giving him this photograph of Missoula and the Clark Fork. This is taken by our webmaster and poster wizard Karen Lose, so that he will not forget Missoula or that a spirit runs through it. Our hope in sponsoring this talk is that the next terminal illness or death in our families and among our friends will be a better experience because we heard what Ira has to say. We bought his book or borrowed it from the library or our faith community. We found a way to start the conversation in our families about our wishes, and we actually filed an advance directive in the state registry. If you don't know how to do that, the tables downstairs will be glad to tell you. All of us want the best care possible. There is no one better than Ira Byock to teach us how to do this.
Wow. So this is amazing. This is amazing. I've been traveling and speaking a lot and doing a lot of media and all that, and I'm more nervous now than I've been in months. Because, you know, because I'm really one of you, you know. We learned a lot of this stuff together. I wrote a book, darn fine book, A Few Months to Live, with about a research project with Roger and Jana, and Kay is here, Kay Norris, other principal investigator with MDP, and so many of you are part of my life and professional development. You know, authors write books and then they go on tour to sell their book. I gotta tell you, it's far more accurate to say that I wrote this book to give this talk. I really, I'm speaking with you, but also of you, or, you know, together with you, because we're all in this one together. I'm reminded being here and would like to actually dedicate this evening to my friend Frank Walker, physician, longtime physician in Missoula, who I came here to work with at Community Medical Center. Frank is over at St. Pat's now, working hard to survive after brain surgery. Please keep him in your thoughts, as he is in mine. My wife Ivana and I are once and future Missoulians. You ain't seen the last of us. We never gave up our home up the Rattlesnake, and we sneak back to town whenever we can, and we'll be back to town for good before too many years go by. But we've been busy. In a sense, this book, The Best Care Possible, is a story about what we've been doing since we left, which is building a program at, a leading academic medical center and trying to do all the stuff that we talked about and have promoted from Missoula, Montana, in this East Coast Ivy League, cutting-edge medical center, without skimping. That's what's really cool about it. We haven't, we've tried not to skimp at all. And the short story, in case you don't want to read the book, is it really works. Turns out it works really well. People like being well cared for, and doctors like their patients to be well cared for, and a health system really smiles broadly when people are really well cared for and quality is there. I want to acknowledge Yvonne, who, my name's on the cover of this book, but her fingerprints are on every single page, every line of every page. She was a part of the inception of this book, and has been through every draft of every chapter, and many of those were many drafts of many chapters. So thanks for being here. I have some prepared remarks that I'm going to talk about in like 30 minutes or no more than 40 minutes, and then I'm going to shut up and dialogue, because that's really what I'm looking forward to, is taking questions and just talking about how we can do all this better. So I wrote this book because we make dying a lot harder than it has to be in America today. And I see so much suffering that is frankly avoidable or unnecessary. And I know, because we live it, that better care is possible. Not just a little bit better care, but much better care is possible. So I wrote the book because if you write a book, you have standing, at least for a few months, to sort of speak into the culture. Your op-eds get attention at the editorial offices of the newspapers. You get invited to be on, radio and TV. I've been on Fox and Friends. Go figure. I said yes immediately. Absolutely. And I've been on NPR, the Talk of the Nation, and so many local NPR affiliates, including here with Sally Mock. And it's really cool to be in dialogue. I've been doing this. You do these radio interviews, satellite interviews they call them, and you sit in your office and you do 15 or 20 interviews a day with various drive time radio or other news talk. And I've been all across the spectrum, from Christian radio to black hip hop and rap radio to right-wing news talk. Everybody I've talked with, frankly, endorses the idea that we want the best care possible for people through the end of life. It turns out the cultural chasm out there is not a chasm at all, it's a mirage. The vast majority of Americans stand on high common ground across, sort of feuding factions that look like we're polarized in America. I think we can get to yes and really dramatically change the way people are cared for through the end of life in America if we can actually engage in a conversation. If we can look at what the best programs and examples teach us, healthcare but also community-based programs, and then use that as an example of what's possible, we could just in less than a generation profoundly change the way we look at and approach late life and the very end of life and family caregiving. And we need to do that because, frankly, if we don't, we're going to leave to the next generation and to human civilization to come an eroded fabric of community. Because this stuff is really at the whoop and wharf of community life. Let me just say that we live in unprecedented times, and we're here and at this juncture of human civilization for the best of reasons, because we have unprecedented, incredible power to stave off death, to fight disease, to fight injuries. If you arrive, even severe trauma, if you arrive alive at an emergency department today, you're going to survive that trauma almost for sure. Could never say that, even in the middle of the 20th century. Nowadays, things like congestive heart failure are chronic illnesses. They used to kill people just like that. Kidney disease, of course, would kill people quickly. Liver disease. Cancers, nowadays, if we can't cure them, and we cure about 60% of solid tumors these days, which is pretty good, but we've got a long way to go. But when we can't cure cancer, it often becomes a chronic illness that people live with sometimes for decades, but at least for months, and sometimes very well. So things are changed, and we need to celebrate all of the power that we have to prolong life and to live well with chronic illness. Nowadays, however, people come to the end of life often having 3 and 4 and 5 diagnoses that used to take us quite quickly. All of that, I think, by the way, is to be celebrated. The problem is we have yet to make even one person immortal. That's a problem. Because it makes it hard to know when to stop and when to shift goals, and because people are living longer with a higher burden of illness than ever before. Dying is hard, but these days, up to 20% of people die in ICUs, where very few people want to die. Over 70%, more like 80% of people on every survey that's been done say they want to be at home, surrounded by people they love, comfortable, clean, with their dignity preserved. But about 70% of people die in institutions, either nursing homes or hospitals, and those vary in proportion, but the sum of about 70% has been reasonably constant. People often, as I said, are in ICUs. Often the focus of care is all medical and it's only on their diseases. Dying is hard, but it doesn't have to be this hard. I've been thinking a lot about the limits of our imagination these days. Imagination fails us on the one hand because when someone is seriously ill, someone we love, we can't imagine anything worse than that they might die. And yet it turns out there are things worse than having someone you love die. There's having someone you love die badly, suffering as he or she dies. And worse than that is later realizing that much of their suffering was unnecessary. On the other hand, our imagination fails us because we can't imagine anything possible that might be of any value associated with this time of life we call dying. And that's because many of us have seen people suffer and can't really think of somebody who's died who hasn't been consumed by suffering. Many physicians that I know fall into that category. But in fact, there are things of value associated with this time of life. When we medical people are doing the basics of controlling people's discomfort and managing their pain and their breathlessness and their GI upset and then, all of that, often these times have profound value for patients, people who are ill and their families. And that's part of the human endowment as well, that we have to, as a society, preserve and promote. That's why stories are so important. Because without the stories that can help us imagine first how bad things might be, but also how good things could be, it's hard to sort of move in a direction that's desirable. And I think that's part of the problem. We don't know what success would look like when we think about these times of life of serious illness, caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease, or caring for somebody who's hospitalized now and has serious infections and has been in the hospital for 2 or 3 weeks and is getting worse, not better, or is just languishing and not getting better. What does success look like now? The phrase I find I use most often when I meet patients is, I want to give you the best care possible. That's what we all want as physicians, nurses, social workers, chaplains. That's what we want for the people we love. That's what we want for the people in our families who we love. One size doesn't fit all, of course. And so, I know that that's the one thing everybody agrees with, but then at least it gives me sort of the phrase creates a vessel into which we can begin to pour meaning. And I just You know, I usually say I need to know more about who you are as a person to know, you know, what the best care would look like now for you. And we need to keep exploring that as we go forward, whether you get better with treatment of this illness or whether you don't. What does the best care look like for you? That involves more than just treatments for your disease. That includes, you know, attention to your well-being, to your comfort and quality of life, and to your family support. These days, what I do in palliative care, and what ought to be available to all people who are seriously ill, is this notion of shared decision-making. You know, people hear that phrase? It's still sort of new. You know about informed consent, right? So you sign, you know, for an operation or some procedure, and you're fully informed about the potential benefits and the risks. And shared decision-making is sort of the proper process to get to informed consent. But it's reasonably new. When I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, shared decision-making occurred when a doctor shared his decisions with you. We've come a long way from that. Nowadays, doctors are supposed to partner with patients, find out what the patient's values and preferences are, and then help the patient by applying those values and preferences to the particularity of the person's condition, available treatment options to achieve, you know, achievable healthcare outcomes. Okay? Individual values and preferences applied to the particular medical condition in service of achievable healthcare outcomes. That's a, you know, not terribly esoteric, but a meticulous process that ought to go on multiple times a day in every, you know, physician's practice. Certainly when somebody is critically ill. So the best care possible takes a process, takes this notion of preparation, as Jana was saying. National Healthcare Decisions Day is coming up the 16th, right after, you know, we deal with taxes, we can deal with death. But it's a good time to sit down and have the conversation. At very least, giving the people that you trust formal permission to speak for you. That's part of it. It doesn't just happen, oh, I hope I get a good death. That doesn't just happen. It takes some preparation. I have an advance directive, not so much even for me as for my wife and my daughters, who I know if I'm in a car accident later tonight, have a serious head injury, they're going to struggle with treatment, decisions about my treatment and care. I can't stop that. But I can give them clear authority to speak for me so that no ethics committee or judge needs to get involved. And I can give them a sense of what I would want so that perhaps the decisions they make or struggle with will be slightly less heavy, slightly less burdensome. The best care possible takes preparation. It takes doctors who, you know, not only understand the physiology and pharmacology of disease, understand the ethics of decision-making, the process of shared decision-making, doctors who can actually communicate clearly, and doctors who enjoy working with people. I work in a place nowadays where I know very good doctors, really brilliant, committed, high-valued people who are more comfortable doing research than working with seriously ill people. I value their contributions, but if someone I love is seriously ill, I want a doctor who actually enjoys doing this, who derives some satisfaction from it, doesn't see it as a chore. And doctors have to work in a health system that's actually functional. Oy vey. We got a problem with that. I mean, no, I'm not pointing fingers, and it's frankly nobody's fault, but our healthcare system is really not very functional. Our healthcare system is really a disease treatment system in America. And it's a powerful one, and one that, again, I applaud. I love the fact that we can treat disease and keep people alive quite long, you know, and sometimes cure people that have just dramatically serious illness. I still hang out in ICUs a lot. That's where we do a lot of our consults. And I just applaud and celebrate the power that we have in this 21st century. But we're not so good at treating people with illness, their well-being, their feelings, and their emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. or their family support. 30% of families who've had a loved one in an ICU have verifiable post-traumatic stress disorder. Think about that. You know, family caregiving has become its own diagnosis. I mean, it's really a source of significant stress. And it takes a family. The best care possible also takes a family. It's not just about medical treatment. It's not just about professional care. Over 61 million Americans now are participating in the care of a loved one. 41 million spend over 18 hours a week caring for a frail or ill or disabled adult. The best assisted living situation I know of is called a married couple. It's a model that's working out reasonably well. Old married couples take care of one another, but we don't support them very well. You know, for every Harry who's got a little Parkinson's disease and early memory loss and arthritis and heart failure, there tends to be a Shirley who is okay, but she's got hypertension and diabetes and macular degeneration and a little osteoporosis and maybe some spinal stenosis. This is like the bread and butter of, you know, internal medicine and geriatrics and palliative care these days. And that's normal. It's just a new normal, and we haven't figured out now what the place of medicine is in this. It's to support people and to support, you know, families. But remember, I said shared decision-making is values and preferences applied to particular medical condition and achievable health outcomes. Living forever is not an achievable health outcome. But that's what people want to do. I mean, if I've learned anything in the practice of medicine these 30 plus years, it's been that people don't want to be dead. And their families don't want their loved ones to die, at least not usually. No, I'm only kidding. And doctors don't want their patients to die. And we have all of this power to bring to bear to keep people alive. We just have to figure out what success looks like now, and that's always going to be a balance. In shared decision-making, often it's the quality of life that helps that. I think about a balance beam of potential benefits versus the known burdens of a treatment and the risks of a treatment. How do you make those decisions? It often balances on a basis of quality of life. If quality of life is good and the burdens are high of treatment and the returns may not be so, may not make things a lot better, well, the very ground of quality of life may incline you away from treatment. If quality of life is horrendous and the treatment offers quality of life not worth living now, and the treatment, even though it's high risk, gives you a chance of living better without such extraordinary pain or suffering, well, you may lean toward treatment. But that process, while I don't know what the best care possible is for you or you, I know how to get there with real consistency. That's part of what I've tried to put out there in the stories that I tell. Okay. The best care possible takes a community. And that's why it's so exciting to be here. Because this place is really a community. I mean, just look around. How cool is this? But I learned here that community is a verb. It has the substance of a noun, but it's all about mutuality and belonging and mutual responsiveness and your well-being matters to me, right? That's the sense of community as a verb. We, in fact, taught the rest of the country something during the years of the Missoula Demonstration Project. I wish it was still going on, and we didn't achieve all that we wanted, but we achieved a fair amount. We made it clear that this was not just about medical care, that it was about the community. We involved faith communities. All of us got involved as faith communities. We involved the schools and teachers, and the attorneys were deeply involved. And EMS, not only the hospital-based providers, pharmacists were involved, the funeral industry and bereavement specialists were involved. It was very cool. Part of what I'm talking about in this book is telling stories of community as a verb. I think I'll read one in a minute. The best care possible, of course, not only takes good health care, it also takes love. Woo. Now, this is really an interesting thing for me to be talking about out there on, TV. Loving care as being critically important. But it's so importantly radical. People, when they first hear it, they kind of recoil. Did you hear what he said? He says he loves his patients. Unseemly. I think it must bring up like sexual connotations or something. But how bizarre is that? It's okay to love one another. Love has actually been the initial historic impetus of the healthcare professions. That's what drives all of it. It's still the driving force in the healthcare professions. And I got to tell you, they don't talk about it much because it's misunderstood, but doctors come to love many of their patients. When you work with people who are seriously ill over many months, it's not uncommon that real affection develops. It's not unseemly. It's in fact quite wholesome. And I think we need to make it okay to talk about. Love is also the impetus between people, of course. It's the most important thing. It's the thing that matters most to people. Think about the messages from the captain of the Kursk, the doomed Soviet submarine. He was writing blind, but said he loves, just want you to know it wasn't bad, and I love you. The messages from the Twin Towers, the phone calls from the planes. I want to read a story that just gives a sense, I think, of the radical nature of love at the end of life. Let me see if I can find it. This is, let's see. There's so much I want to read here. I just changed the section I'm going to read, but I'm going to read two. I talk about loving care as being sort of a corrective of this highly technical, disease-based treatment that we pay so much for that it's destroying our manufacturing segment, our schools, our police. I'm not opposed to spending a lot of money on people who are seriously ill. That's appropriate, but we're not getting the return on our investment. Spending twice as much as any other developed nation. But back to loving care. Loving care can help alleviate suffering, but a patient does not need to be suffering to benefit. Seriously ill people often benefit from being nurtured or pampered a bit. Massage, Reiki, music, expressive arts, and writing, perhaps having a volunteer visit, can help make someone's difficult day a little lighter and brighter. Hard-boiled cynics may scoff at my alleged naivete, having spent nearly a decade and a half working in emergency departments where cynicism and dark humor are as ubiquitous as dark coffee. I can understand their doubts. In this situation, however, cynicism is not warranted. I regularly invite journalists and policymakers to spend a day with our team at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, and I've seen jaded agency administrators, politicians, and journalists melt when they see loving care in action. Seeing a terminally ill patient laugh while reading the newspaper with one of our No One Alone volunteers, glimpsing a nurse humming as she gives a debilitated patient a bed bath, as if the purpose of the act was to cause pleasure and the person became clean merely as a byproduct. Witnessing a person in pain fall gently asleep while having a foot massage. Attending our morning clinical huddle and hearing us wrestle with the strategies for relieving a person's pain, but also ideas for helping a family honor and celebrate a person who is facing the end of life. A politically conservative state legislator was with our team for a day during the week we were helping to care for Mrs. Gold. When I met her, Mrs. Gold had been in the hospital for 9 days and in the ICU for 7 days, the victim of insidious pulmonary hypertension and pulmonary fibrosis that had caused no symptoms but had been damaging her lungs and her heart for many months. Now, at the age of 78, she needed mechanical ventilation to breathe, but she steadfastly refused to be intubated. Instead, she was fitted with a BiPAP mask that blew oxygen-enriched compressed air through her nose and mouth and into her lungs. She could speak in short, well-planned sentences if the bypass mask was removed for a few moments. But she mostly communicated by gesturing expressively with her hands and her eyes. She had no problem conveying that she was not happy. She told us in one breath, "I don't want to live like this." We were able to make her comfortable with small doses of morphine. She was alert, not suffering, but ready to die. She had raised 4 daughters and 2 sons after her husband had died when he was just 38 years old. As the matriarch of her large family, she wanted to make sure that they understood and accepted her decision to die, and was willing to hang on a few more days for their sake. Her children and their spouses and her many grandchildren ached with grief at the thought of her dying. Ultimately, however, each one supported her decision. During one of several meetings with her family, a daughter in her 40s spoke for the assembled relatives. "We're as close as any family could ever hope to be," she told me. Overnight, her ICU room was transformed into family space. There was at least 30 photos hung around her ICU room, including one of her own mother as a bride. She was never alone. Usually there were 2 or more family members present. Her pastor visited every other day. I was present on the Saturday afternoon when the BiPAP mask was removed. We gave her small doses of medication. She was sleepy but awake. There was never a hint of distress. The last thing Mrs. Gold saw in this world were the faces of her 6 children and her 2 grandchildren, all touching a part of her, all smiling with tears in their eyes, each saying, "We love you, Mom." One said, "Tell Dad we send our love." These sorts of gentle end-of-life experiences happen fairly commonly in the homes of hospice patients. In reflecting on the case, I realized that in the minds of most people, ICU treatment and hospice-like care are polar opposites, almost the antithesis of each other. Indeed, just a few years ago, I could only have dreamed of being able to extend this level of whole person, whole family, tender and loving care in an academic medical center's ICU. No longer. Every few months, it seems, we celebrate a wedding in the ICU or conduct a renewal of vows in the hospital's chapel. This is exceptional, but it's no longer rare. On that Saturday, I was glad to be shadowed by 3 second-year medical students. They stood beside me as Mrs. Gold died and witnessed what good care through the end of life looks like. The following Monday, I called the legislator and reported how Mrs. Gold had died. He agreed that her experience was illuminating. Then he said, "That's all great, but there isn't a program like this everywhere." True enough. My question is, why not? I got 10 more minutes to talk at you. We can do this. We can transform the way we look at the end of life. We don't need to give up on absolutely cutting-edge medical treatments to help people stay alive. We only need to become individualized in a careful, meticulous way and talk to people about their values and preferences. That includes, how does this story end? We only now ask, what about the next treatment? So would you like to go on a ventilator if you get a pneumonia? We never also ask, are there circumstances in which you would like to be allowed to die gently? I do nowadays, and it's the extremely rare person, like 1 or 2 in my memory, who hasn't said, "Yeah, of course, when my time comes, I want to die gently." If you don't get that out, then you don't have a sense of what's the right care, the best care for this person. These decisions are never going to be easy, but we make them a whole lot harder. As a society, frankly, We need to demand much better care. Part of the reason for writing a book that's story-driven is it expands our imagination so that we have a sense of what's possible. The likelihood is that that's going to frustrate people because they're going to read about the care that we're able to give at Dartmouth and say, well, I want that too. I hope they say that. Part of, a change theory is that people have to know what's possible. They have to be frustrated with the status quo in order to know what to demand. I think that a great deal is possible if we, frankly, take control. People say, well, what's stopping us? Well, frankly, what's been stopping us has been the culture wars. You can't have these conversations in public. It's radioactive to have these conversations. On the one hand, it brings up, the notion of physician-assisted suicide. On the other hand, we have some of a fringe of the pro-life movement who think that hospice and palliative care is promoting a culture of death. We're out there killing Granny. I mean, how bizarre is that? It's really offensive. In fact, a reverence for life permeates this field. In fact, from my perspective, it permeates all of healthcare. You can't see it a lot of the time because of the stress that my colleagues are under. But reverence for life is what motivates us all. We have to really take back. I've gone on now radio and TV and said we're taking back the terms dignity and pro-life. They can't brand them anymore. They can't have them anymore. I am proudly pro-dignity and also proudly, ardently pro-life. And so is everybody else that I know in this field. We don't think that people have to kill themselves to become dignified. We think they already are dignified. Our job, our challenge is to help them to see their inherent dignity reflected in our eyes, to feel dignified by the way they're cared for, not only competently, but tenderly and lovingly. I know that this is possible. People can be helped to feel dignified if they're treated in inherently dignified ways, if they're actually honored and celebrated. Honestly, if that seems Pollyannish, trust me, it's not. It's anthropology. Honestly. And if you want to affirm life, you have to affirm all of life. And that includes the times we call illness and dying and caregiving and grief. This is inherently a life affirmation. The notion, on the other hand, that there's something in Judeo-Christian principles or ethics that requires us to do CPR or put feeding tubes in people or put people on mechanical ventilation is also just simply nonsense. And I say that knowing there are priests in the room. I mean, if I dug in my notes, I could actually quote, from theological works, but just notice that Pope John Paul did not have mechanical ventilation or CPR or tube nutrition and hydration as he died. Neither did Mother Teresa. Both made quite extensive use of medical technology and medical treatment during the last several years of their lives. Very, very good use. And both eventually died gently. It turns out nature, or if you prefer God, gives us gentle ways to leave this life. We just have to figure out these days how to make the best use of medical treatment without playing God, allowing people to die gently. Okay, what else am I talking about? I just want to say two other things. First is that what's really needed is we need the same sort of social and cultural movement that we baby boomers advanced when we were having babies. Right? Just think about it. In the 1950s, 1960s, they didn't let fathers in delivery rooms. I remember reading articles in the medical literature. We were afraid they were going to fall down and faint. I mean, it's so gooey in there. And there were no birthing coaches, right? We even went through a time when women weren't breastfeeding. Look at what we did. In really quite a few short years, we took back the beginning of life. We said, as a culture, as a socio-cultural movement, people who are pregnant and women in pregnancy and delivery require expert medical attention. But that does not define these experiences as being primarily medical. They are primarily personal for the individual and her family. And so we demanded better medical care, but we also said this is personal, not medical. Nowadays, we worry if there isn't a father in the delivery room. What's up? We scold women who don't get birth coaches by the second or third prenatal visit, because things worked out. And by the way, medicine didn't drive this change, but it came along, and with evidence base that showed it was safe and people were having good outcomes, it did support the transformation, but a huge transformation occurred. And I think everybody agrees that better experiences are now possible and routine. A very similar transformation needs to happen at the end of life. The fact that our seriously ill and even dying loved ones require expert medical attention is absolute, and we need to demand it, and it needs to get better than it is now. I don't want to diminish that at all. We've got work to do in healthcare and the medical professions and medical educators. Lots of work to do. But that doesn't define, the need for expert medical attention does not define the experiences as being primarily medical. They are profoundly personal for the individual and his or her family. And so while demanding expert medical attention, we must preserve the personal. If all we do is improve medical treatment for people who are dying, the best we will hope to achieve is a better medicalized end-of-life experience. That's not success. We need to grow the rest of the way up and reintegrate illness and caregiving and dying within the fabric of human life, within our notions of full and even healthy living. And we need a socio-cultural movement to get healthcare and, frankly, social services and our communities to better support people through this. And lastly, part of the reason I've been looking forward to coming here is, and knowing that this is an ecumenical gathering, is because illness and dying really strip away all pretense and expose the spiritual core at the center of the human condition. Whatever language they use for it, it's there. Human spirituality arises in response to the awe-inspiring and terrifying fact of human life, the mystery of life and the universe. We reflexively seek to make meaning out of this mystery and strengthen or make new connections with others. All of that may sound abstract, this notion of spirituality, a philosophical assertion. But in fact, it's a common empiric experience of people who are seriously ill. When things fall away, the spiritual core is revealed. It's like the force of impending death is like a hot wind that burns away all else. Mortality has taught me that life is inherently spiritual, whether or not one has a religion. I tell the story of Mr. Grady, not his real name, but he was a real guy. An old Vermont farmer who I saw in clinic one day. He was seriously ill, and I asked him, as I ask everybody, Mr. Grady, do you consider yourself a spiritual man? He said, not me, Doc. I said, well, do you have a sense of where we go after we leave this life? He said, yep, the worms go in, the worms go out. I half expected such a response, so I followed up. I said, and where will the worms go in and out of your bones, Mr. Grady? He said, oh, Doc, we have a farm on our family farm up in Thetford. We have a cemetery. We Grady's been buried there for years, over a century, and I suspect my children and my grandchildren will be there too. Very interesting. Mr. Grady doesn't go to church or believe in God. You know, he doesn't pray. And yet he has a visceral sense of connection to the earth and to a family that preceded him for generations and will follow him for generations to come. If that's not spiritual, I'm not sure what to call it. It is inherently meaningful to him, and there's a connection that is open-ended into, an open-ended future. Let me also, how am I doing on time? Almost done? I got 2 more stories, quick stories. Alice Failing, 47-year-old woman with advanced intraperitoneal cancer and ascites, who was admitted to the hospital when her left leg suddenly turned cold and blue. After the successful removal of an arterial clot restored circulation to the leg, she developed kidney failure. During rounds 1 Sunday morning, I was on call. I visited Alice in her hospital room. Following the requisite update on her pain and her bowels, we indulged in musings about illness, healing, God, and love. The conversation began when I asked about a collection of Rumi poems that she had on her bedside table. We read a few of them, and then I shared a favorite poem with her, and I asked her to guess who wrote it. You do not need to leave your room. Remain sitting at your table and listen. Do not even listen, simply wait. Do not even wait. Be quiet, still, and solitary. The world will freely offer itself to you to be unmasked. It has no choice. It will roll in ecstasy at your feet. That's wonderful, she said, but I have no idea who the poet is. Franz Kafka, I replied. Alice was surprised that Kafka, the quintessential existentialist, whose writings typically portray the universe as cold and impersonal, leaving each individual exposed to circumstance and happenstance, would offer a vision of an ecstatic world. This led Alice and me to talk about chaos theory and fractals and patterns within randomness. And she spoke about healing and well-being in the face of loss and her sense of God within us and all that is. She knew that she was dying and hated to leave her husband with whom she felt ever more deeply in love. Alice said that except for her physical ailments, she had felt well and alive these last few months. I want to read one last story and then stop. And this is a story about boundaries. And this is a story I talk to medical students about. And nowadays, colleagues, I just used it for the first time at a conference I was at the other day of physicians and nurses and social workers. Because there's all this worry about whether doctors can be friends with patients. And let me just say clearly, of course we can. It would be bizarre if we couldn't. It's such a normal impulse. And that one can maintain professional boundaries while bringing one's whole self to the clinical encounter. You can actually be there authentically. Boundaries are about behaviors, things that you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to take money from patients. You're not supposed to have sex with patients. Right? You're not supposed to kill patients intentionally. Those are the big 3. I'll review them if you'd like. But besides that, it's okay to be authentic with patients. I kibitz with people a lot. That's part of my style. But I sometimes I'm strict with people. I set limits with people when they're doing things that are wrong, even if they're seriously ill. Right? It's not permission to be bad. So all of this comes out in the story of Bert. See how this goes. Bert was a patient I met when the bone marrow transplant team at Dartmouth-Hitchcock asked us to see him because of overwhelming anxiety associated with his illness and being confined to the hospital for long weeks at a time. Bert had something called myelodysplastic syndrome, and he had unfortunately developed leukemia, which is not all that unusual. In Bert's case, his only chance of being cured was a stem cell transplant. Bert wanted to live, but he was reeling from the physical and emotional assaults of his disease and its treatment. For him, being in the hospital before and after undergoing a stem cell transplant was a bit like going to jail. Actually, it was a whole lot worse. When our team met him, Bert had been in the hospital for over a week one of many hospitalizations, and he was figuratively climbing the walls, although if it hadn't been for a bad hip, the result of an old hip injury, he hadn't hurt so much, he would have been literally climbing the walls. As it was, he was tethered to a cluster of clear plastic tubes, 2 pumps, 3 IV bags, all hanging from a steel rolling stand. When he had the energy and when his hip wasn't aching too much, he paced around the room with that stand, a bit like a mouse on a wheel. But much of the time, he was just too exhausted and uncomfortable to walk farther than to and from his bathroom within his room. So he spent hours and hours lying in bed. Now, Bert was a tough, no-nonsense guy. At least that was the persona he cultivated. Within the first 2 minutes of meeting him, Bert would proudly and loudly tell you that he was a right-wing conservative and that Rush is right. When tests and treatments allowed and he wasn't puking, he listened faithfully to Rush Limbaugh or watched Fox News or used his laptop and the hospital's wireless internet access to stay current on right-wing websites. Before I met Bert for the first time, he had Googled me. And he had tagged me as a public radio listening, latte sipping, left-leaning liberal. All true. And he was eager for a fight. But his persona was 90% bravado. To me, or anyone skilled at reading people, Bert was an open book. Within about 5 minutes of meeting him, it was evident that he thoroughly enjoyed people and valued relationships. He just loved arguing, particularly about politics. He wanted my help and our team's help, but I soon learned that we would have to deliver it on his terms. So political jousting became the currency of our daily visits. On most days, after my usual questions about his pain and how he slept and whether he had an appetite in his bowels, he preferred to argue and advance his right-wing political viewpoint. Through it all, Bert and I became good friends. We could have serious conversations when we needed to, including sometimes tender discussions about things that kept him awake some nights, things he regretted, including some that he had never told anyone else. According to the nurses on 1 West, where most of the cancer patients are at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, who all knew Bert well, I also became a tonic for his anxieties and not uncommon irritability. On one occasion, while in the hospital for a 6-week stretch, Bert developed a serious infection, actually 2 infections, a bacterial infection and a fungal infection. And he was receiving high-dose, very potent IV antibiotics. Despite the IV fluids and red blood cell transfusions whenever he became too anemic, the hematologists were having trouble keeping his blood pressure from falling. There was growing concern that he might need vasopressor medications, which would in turn require him to be transferred to the ICU. Not a good thing in Bert's case. When I visited him that day, he felt weak and he had no appetite whatsoever, but he said he wasn't in pain and he did not otherwise feel particularly ill. I noted to myself that he looked better than his labs, or current blood counts, or the array of active medical problems in his chart. I felt hopeful that he'd once again pull through. So the next morning, I brought Bert something that I told him would speed his recovery. On the wall of his room, directly in front of his bed, I taped an 8x11 sheet of white paper on which I had printed in inch-high bold type, "In case of low blood pressure, lift this page." I explained that whenever his blood pressure got too low, I had instructed the nurses to lift the page and tape the cover sheet up. And I demonstrated lifting the cover to reveal a color photo that I had copied from the web and printed at home. It was of liberal cable talk show host Keith Olbermann, who stood holding a large American flag. Bert rose up as if stung by a bee. "I hate that son of a bitch," he blurted out. "I think it's working," I announced. "I bet your blood pressure is up at least 20 points, and I puffed out my chest and strutted around the room with mock therapeutic pride. That did it. His angry veneer collapsed, and Bert erupted in howls of laughter. Just then, a nurse came in to see what the ruckus was all about. Bert told her to report me to the authorities for abuse. We had a good laugh, and I stayed for a while to allow him time to give me the right-wing news of the day, but mercifully my pager went off and I excused myself and said I'd see him tomorrow. On the rounds the next morning, when I arrived at the counter of the charting station nearest his room, the nurses and aides were still talking about the sign I had put up. They reported that Bert complains about it to everyone who visits, staff, family, friends alike. But, they laughed, he hasn't taken it down. So I think I'm just going to close there and take questions, and thank you again for coming. It's just so nice that everybody's here. I can't tell you that you even remember me.
I have a question with a comment. When my dad died at nearly 87, and apparently spent the last few days without being able to speak, my mother said the last thing he said to her was, "I wonder what it would be like to be dead." I've never had that experience before.
But we're all going to have it for a long time.
It's good to see you again.
Hi, Liz.
I have a professional question, I guess. All of us have been following your career and hold you in great esteem for the work you've done. But how do we deal with the fact that we are moving more and more towards the day when the physicians in the hospital taking care of us don't have a clue who we are?
You know, I think it's an incredible problem, and in a sense I'm contributing to it, because here we are at Dartmouth-Hitchcock and we've added yet another specialty team to the mix. We think we're a corrective in trying to be truly person-centered, but that's part of the problem, and it's part of the challenge, because nowadays everything is so specialized that, that there's no one captain of the ship. And so now we've developed care managers, which are fine, but they tend to be located within agencies that also only have purview over part of our journey. I think there's a number of things. Within healthcare, we need to start assigning care managers or navigators that are truly person-centered and follow people throughout the course of an illness. But I also think that can happen as a community too. And I think communities can help manage and provide continuity to people. Now, I don't mean just communities as geographic communities, though there are examples of that. There are places in Vermont that have community health nurses to actually follow people just because they live in the village or in a small community. But there are communities of our workplace. There are faith communities that can own this time of life and support people through a course of illness, providing them with advocacy to get access to the right services, not just medical, though medical too, but community-based services that they need, and also some continuity across appointments and across the months. Again, not all advanced care planning has to be centered in healthcare. It could be centered in faith communities, in aging services, or workplace community, could be aging services and aging networks. It could be focused or based in workplace communities, both for the individual who is ill and the caregiving family member. So your point is very well taken. Continuity and person-centered planning is really needed. We have to actually evolve ways of getting it, and I don't think there's one, or delivering it, and I don't think there's just one way. I think there's probably multiple ways. Larry, hi. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you. I'd like your thoughts on an issue that seems to be, look at the mic.
an issue that really complicates this end-of-life issue. If the patient is in fact still conscious and competent,
Right.
then many decisions that can be made with the family, with the patient, with the healthcare provider. Any thoughts or suggestions on what we do when that person is conscious but not competent in the depths of Alzheimer's?
Right.
And no longer understands, no longer can give their consent. They may have, when they were alive, been very cogent about not wanting to live the way they're now living, and yet they're now not in a position to do that, and they're conscious, and our laws don't seem to accommodate that very well.
I have to set aside the law issue for a moment, but I'll come back to it. I think for people who are no longer able to make decisions for themselves, in large measure, unless there's instructions not to, we look toward families, of course, to make decisions for them. Who better than somebody who loves the person who is ill to make decisions? And it's useful if there is an advance directive, power of attorney for health care or a living will, to look at what the person had said when they had capacity. But if not, the way I approach this is, I start by finding out who that person is, not just as a medical entity, but as a human being. I often will say, tell me about your mom, or tell me about your dad. And I don't mean just about their health care conditions. I want to know where they grew up. Who were their parents, or what was their family like? When did they marry, your father? When did your mom marry your father? What kind of work did she do outside of the home, if at all? What did she like to do when she wasn't working? What motivates her? What's the most important stuff in her life? And in taking that history, which really only takes 5 or less than 10 minutes usually, I can deliver this person from anonymity. No longer are they simply the demented woman who has aspiration pneumonia and poorly controlled diabetes that we're caring for. The person becomes a whole person with values and preferences and aversions, and at that point, then when we look at what the condition is now, what are the available treatments, and what are the achievable outcomes? What is the prognosis, not only for her life and survival, but for her functional capacity, for her ability to enjoy life. Given what those are, then what would your mom want? What do you think your mom would want if she could see herself now and be making decisions consistent with her values and preferences? Either way that goes, it provides clarity for a family. If mom is somebody who believed that you should quest for life throughout whatever happens, and she wanted to stay alive as long as possible, and dependency was not an issue for her, but quality, quantity of life was really a high value, then you know that we're going to treat that pneumonia and do whatever we can within some reason to help her live as long as possible. If she was somebody who, quite the contrary, wouldn't want to have been dependent, and for whom life beyond being able to really engage in activities, watching TV, playing bingo, enjoying her kids, life beyond that wasn't a value, then we might talk about what to do to focus on her comfort, but allow pneumonia or some other complication of her Alzheimer's disease to allow her to die gently. So it's helpful for me. I think these are not medical decisions as much as profoundly personal decisions that have medical complication or consequences, and medical decisions that flow from them. But I have to know about the person, often within the context of a family, to get a sense of what's right. Now, the next thing you're probably going to ask is, well, what if there's conflict in the family? And that happens a lot, and that, that's where things like advance directives can really avoid a lot of family conflict before it starts. But I try to, by focusing on the person rather than just their medical problems, I try to kind of bring people along to get a sense of providing the best care possible for your mother, for instance, now, And beyond just treating disease or not treating disease, and beyond just her physical comfort, I actually try to expand the therapeutic goals of saying, whatever we do, we're going to honor and celebrate her during this obviously late chapter in her life. And that often will help people, because it's hard, if you love somebody so much and you think that their life is at risk, it's hard to just be saying, well, I don't want you to treat the pneumonia, and that's my loving act. It doesn't feel right somehow, even though it may be the right thing. So I also want to introduce the notion of what would it be like to really pamper your mom, to nurture her, to honor and celebrate her during this time. And that's an affirmative set of things that we can do that resonates deeply within the large majority of people, like, yeah, that's what we want to do for mom. Yes. Oh.
I wrote any comments when a family or loved member is dying, giving them permission to die.
Father Hogan asked about if somebody, a family member is dying, is there wisdom, I guess, in giving them permission to die? And often there is, because the thing is, we matter to one another, and nobody wants to sever the relationship or feel like the relationship's coming to an end. And frankly, nobody wants to leave this life. So knowing that mortality is a given, and if life is a God-given gift, it's a finite gift, at least this life. So giving people permission to leave this life without them feeling it's disloyal is sometimes just an incredible gift to give. I see that with some frequency.
Hi, Dr. Byron. Oh, I just wanted to ask, could you explain the difference between palliative and hospice care?
Oh, great question. So everybody hear that? The difference between palliative care and hospice care. So palliative care is the discipline that hospice delivers. These days, palliative care has grown out of a hospice base and to reach into places where hospice programs have had difficulty penetrating. ICUs, hospitals in general, dialysis units, number of settings in which hospice, particularly under Medicare, has been challenged to penetrate. But in America, hospice began as a countercultural movement. Frankly, in the 1970s and early 1980s, sort of was a response to people dying badly, mostly in hospitals, often in pain, too often alone. And then gradually, as hospice matured, it has been reincorporated within healthcare. But under Medicare, it's not enough to be dying to get hospice. You also have to agree you are dying. And I got to tell you, not a lot of people are eager to do that. And under Medicare, you have to give up treatments for your disease in order to get this comprehensive program for your comfort and quality of life that hospice provides. So that's a problem, because hospice really is the gold standard. But under Medicare, both pays for hospice, which is a good thing, but it also limits access to hospice if there's a late stage treatment. And because science keeps giving us late stage treatments that are pretty good, including some of the new cancer treatments are pretty darn good. They're expensive, but sometimes they work and give people months of good life. People are coming to hospice very late because they don't want to give up the opportunity to be treated. So palliative care has sort of evolved to to reach into some of the nooks and crannies of healthcare where people can get treatment concomitant with, at the same time as they're getting treatments for their disease, they can get a team approach to their comfort and quality of life. We just don't have a reimbursement stream, which is too bad. Yes, hi.
I'm just wondering, over the course of time, partially by being a member of a countercultural perspective on a subject, and now working over a long period of time and having a lot of your work confirmed, just stories that we hear confirm the beliefs that you've had and continue to promote. So either over time, what have been the biggest surprises, or maybe the biggest changes in direction in your thinking as you've met a new person, you've seen a different situation, that have been stumbling blocks in sort of the consistency of the message?
Mostly it's been expanded, but I mean, nowadays I'm a medical educator at frankly one of the best medical schools there is. I mean, one of the top tier medical schools. I have to tell you, we're still failing our medical students. We're not teaching them how to care well for dying people, for seriously ill people. We're not teaching them how to communicate well, to deliver bad news, to counsel people through this inherently difficult but normal time in human life. So I mean, I knew that, but I didn't know how challenging it was until recently. And it puts me in an awkward position because I'm now a medical educator, I'm a professor, but we're not doing it well. And again, that's part of why I'm coming back to saying, we need a citizen consumer movement, because we could dramatically change medical education. We have the expertise to do it, we have the money to do it, we have the time to do it. We don't have the will. It becomes political, and there's pushback. But I could say that about a number of things. We know how to do this so much better than we're doing it. And we're not doing it because of politics and this mirage that there's this big controversy out there, so you can't talk about it. I don't know. I guess, here we are, we have this crisis that surrounds the way we care for people and the way we die, and yet we know that we could give much better care and spend actually about maybe 20 to 30% less money, and we're not doing it. What's up with that?
Maybe one more question.
Hi, Dr. Byock. I'm from Canada, and I was wondering, have you any contacts in Canada that are doing research or work in this area? And my mom is 85 years old.
Where is she? Where is she?
She's in Brantford, Ontario.
Brantford, Ontario. So I'm married to a Canadian. Would you stand up? Sometimes, she's also American now, by the way, but sometimes we still eat Canadian. We have maple bars and things. No, that's just kidding. I have quite a few family and friends in Canada, and Canada's ahead of us in this regard. Canada's palliative care is much more extensive and better developed. It does vary by regions and by provinces, but in Montreal and Quebec it's very strong. Actually, Ontario is pretty strong. BC is quite strong. The models change a little bit from place to place. In BC, it's more of a hospice model, but it's better financed because it's universal health care. And the deal is that better care is actually less expensive because you prevent crises, you have continuity, you anticipate needs before people find them. That people don't have to feel like they're the first person on a planet to ever go through this as an individual or a family. So it actually lines up very well, and the provincial governments have figured this out. And a lot of the early work in developing programs came from Canada. Yvonne Corbet here, I met because she was at McGill in the leading palliative care, academic palliative care program in North America back in the, I won't tell you what decade, but it was a long time ago. So yeah. Jana's going to make us stop. Oh.
You mentioned at the beginning.
Hi, Donna.
Hi, at the beginning of your talk about your no one alone volunteers.
Yes. Sure. So the no one alone volunteers. So I mentioned that what we came to Dartmouth to try to give one more national example of a palliative care program that was built on a full-service hospice model. The true interdisciplinary team, physicians, nurse practitioners, nurses, social work, chaplain, and we wanted healing arts, massage, Reiki, you know, we have a writer who pulls poems out of people, we have music therapists, or music, not thanatologist, but somebody who does play harp and engages people in played music, and we have a graphic artist who, you know, helps people paint little watercolors and like. But part of that was we felt we needed volunteers, and so we have now 35 or more trained volunteers who simply sit with people within the hospital, visit. They deliver newspapers to people in the morning. It's good for boredom, you know, also good for constipation, by the way, and, you know. They'll just sit with people, kibitz with people. I've given them the 3 charges to combat isolation, loneliness, and boredom. 3 factors that erode quality of life when people are in the hospital, particularly for long periods of time. This we can fix, or at least ameliorate. Isolation, loneliness, and boredom. What we do, by the way, we train them. It's a long training. We're just doing it right now, actually. There's a 6-week training going on right now. At the ceremony, the graduation ceremony, we play pomp and circumstance. It's really cute. We hand them a diploma. But I also tell them that now, given that you've been screened and trained and will be supervising you, you have a license to love. You can go out and just sit with people. You can kibitz with people. You can read them the newspaper. If they're not NPO, you can get them a treat. You know, whatever it is, just to humanize what is often a very difficult environment for people. So that's what, and we call them the No One Alone volunteers. Oh, you can't turn down George.
Yes.
Sir.
Yes, I'm wondering if there's any chance that legislation would help us to catch up with Canada.
Well, legislation would help. Legislation can't do all of it, but it could do some things. It could get rid of the arbitrary either-or model of disease treatment or hospice care. I mean, that was based in the Medicare statute that was passed in 1981. It was based on the assumption that if you provided full hospice care and full disease treatment, it would be too expensive. Okay, that was logical. We now have good data that proves it was wrong. That actually, if you force people to choose between disease treatment and hospice care, they just come to hospice care very late. They still get treatment. That's part of why over 50% of people die in hospitals and 20% of people die in ICUs, because they come to hospice care very late. The length of stay in hospice care, the median length of stay, has actually fallen from 22 to now 19 days. Okay, so that we're doing brink of death care. We could also use public policy to change staffing in nursing homes. We could start to pay the nurses and the nurses' aides in nursing homes a living wage. I mean that. I mean, that's one of the bedrock problems. You can't staff nursing homes. Nursing homes are about, half to 2/3 what is felt to be safe staffing. And it's just every study that's done shows that, and then it makes a news cycle for one cycle, and then everybody forgets about it. But we could actually increase that, and it probably wouldn't cost a dime more, because the more staff you have, the less people end up getting shipped to the hospital when there's a problem. They keep them there, and they care well for them there. Third, I would say, and then I'll stop, is I could keep going, but we actually need legislation to change medical education, because politically, I can't get more curriculum hours from the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, who is still teaching 200 hours or more of obstetrics to every medical student, whereas almost no very few doctors deliver babies, and everyone who has done a family practice or OBGYN residency after they got out of medical school, right? And oh, by the way, last I checked, only 50% of the population was at risk for having an obstetrical experience. So if I want 100 hours, If I want 100 hours of that, split the difference and give me 100 hours to teach palliative care and hospice, we could do that, but I can't get it through a curriculum committee. You know, I need a legislature to say this has got to happen. We have an aging population. We have a chronic illness is expanding exponentially. We need to teach medical students how to care for an aging population with chronic illness. Duh. But it's not going to happen at the medical school level. I'll tell you, it has to happen at a social level where we boomers take back the end of life. Anyhow, you got me on a roll now. Thank you. Thank you.
I want to get everybody downstairs.
Okay. Thank you very much for being here.